Understanding needs and expectations of interested parties, Clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013. Hi friends, I welcome you all here in this exciting training session being conducted by TNV Academy. Today, in this session, we will discuss about Clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013, which talks about the understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties with reference to information security management system. So, let's get going and start our discussion. Let me explain you that what we will be covering in this chapter. In this chapter, we will be covering the clause 4.3 of ISO 27001-2013, which talks about the interested parties for an organization and their needs and expectations by keeping ISO 27001 and their needs and expectations by keeping ISO 27001-2013 in reference. Reference clause within standards or the other standards which can be useful for this chapter. Reference clause within standards or the other standards which can be useful for this chapter. If we talk about clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013, then for understanding the same, you does not essentially require the knowledge of any other clause. However, it should be noted that for defining and determining the requirements of clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013, it is important that requirements of clause 4.1 has been taken care of. External reference for the chapter. If we talk about the external references that you need to know for understanding the clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013, then you should have an updated version standard copy of ISO 22300-2018 with you. ISO 22300-2018 has definitions for several technical terminologies that are used under different clauses of ISO 27001-2018. So, we suggest you that you should keep a copy of the standard with you for your ready reference. Also, for understanding the needs and expectations of all the possible interested parties, you would have to refer ISO 19011-2018 standard. Outcome of the chapter. At the end of this chapter, you will have a thorough understanding of the below mentioned concepts which falls under clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013. What interested parties are in reference to ISO 27001-2013? How can you identify who all can be interested parties for an organization? What are their needs and expectations, and what are the types of their requirements? How an organization can satisfy all their interested parties on their needs and expectations? How the organizational activities can impact the need and requirement of their interested parties and vice versa. And finally, the way these needs and requirements should be documented by an organization. So let's begin identifying these scenarios and parallel understanding them one by one through a brief introduction of clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013. Brief introduction of clause 4.2. As we mentioned in the earlier part of our discussion, that clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013 talks about the interested parties for an organization and understanding their needs and expectations in return from the organization. We shall begin our discussion by understanding what interested parties are, or basically, so what do we mean by interested parties? Let's take a look at the basic definition. Interested parties means any individual or a group of persons that are affected by your activities and their activities eventually affect you in the return. By this definition, we can say that both the organization and their interested parties means any individual or a group of persons that are affected by your activities and their activities eventually affect you in return. By this definition, we can say that both the organization and their interested parties are interrelated to each other. If we talk in the light of clause 4.2 of ISO 27001-2013, then interested parties are basically stakeholders who can be an individual or a group of people or an entity that has interest in the organizational ISMS. These stakeholders are often impacted by the organizational activities such as change in operational procedure or policy of the organization as a replica their decision also affects the organization in return. Interested parties are often found both inside and outside the organization and may have a specific needs, expectations, and requirements for the organization's information security. Thus, Clause 4.2 helps an organization to identify its interested parties and see what their needs and expectations are with respect to the organization's information security management system. We will talk about who all can be interested parties and how are they identified in detail in our next segment, which defined the requirements of Clause 4.2 of ISO 27001:2013. Requirement of the clause of the standard. The Clause 4.2 of ISO 27001:2013 states the below mentioned requirements from an organization. It says that the organization shall determine A. Interested parties that are relevant to the information security management system, and B. The requirements of these interested parties relevant to information security. Important note: the requirements of interested parties may include legal and regulatory requirements and contractual obligations. So, let's discuss both the requirements of the standard and see who can be the interested parties for an organization and how it can identify them. As we stated earlier, that interested parties can be internal and external both for an organization. So we will list down both of them and briefly describe them. However, we would suggest that in order to understand the needs and expectations of the interested parties, please refer to ISO 19011:2018 standard. External interested parties can include the following: regulators and legislators. These are basically government bodies and entities that are responsible for drafting information security laws and statutory requirements for the organization. Regulators and legislators. These are basically government bodies and entities that are responsible for drafting information security laws and statutory requirements for the organizations operating in the information security domain. Shareholders, owners, and investors. These are the people who are responsible for organizations' financial success. If the organization's ISMS activities are not well maintained, then it can suffer huge economic loss coming from this section of people. Suppliers and contractors. These are the agencies that are providing an organization a service for the completion and delivery of actual organization's product. Basically, they are outsourcing agencies on which the organization depends for fulfilling its actual product requirements. Customers. Customers are the people or the entities that are actually buying an organization's product or services and using them within their domain. They share sensitive information with the organization such as their requirements, design specification, etc. And hence, they are directly interested in the ISMS of the organization. Competitors. They are the people or organizations that can harm or impact an organization's business through several factors such as lowering the cost of product or service. Now, let's talk about the internal interested parties of the organization. Internal interested parties can include the following: decision makers. These are the people within the organization who are responsible for critical decision making that can be for several factors such as policies, operational factors, financial planning, resource planning, etc. The decision taken by these people will have a direct impact on the information security management system of the organization. Process owners, system owners, and knowledge owners. These are the people who have the responsibility of outlining and creating the framework for organizational activities that has been decided by the decision-making people. They own the responsibility of every process being carried out by their subordinates and monitors how they perform on the instruction being given to them. Support functions. They are the people who actually provide outer support for the effective implementation of ISMS within the organization. They can be people from IT department or from human resource department. Employees. They are the actual manpower who are responsible for complying the practices of defined ISMS within the organization. They are the subordinates of the process owners, system owners, knowledge owners, and implement their instruction for the smooth functioning of organizational ISMS. Friends, you need to be very clear with this point that the external and internal interested parties are just not limited to these which we have mentioned above. There can be several other external and internal interested parties as well, such as media, activists, groups, trade unions, etc. But an organization has to define, identify, and prioritize which are the most important ones for them, basis the level of impact they can have on organizational ISMS. Now, let's discuss the basic practices through which an organization can define and identify the probable interested parties. One way is to write a